My name is Maya, and 10 years ago, I was standing on the curb of 42 Maple Lane with my entire life packed into 2 black garbage bags. You're a drain on this family, Maya, my father, Richard, had snarled, his face inches from mine. We spent 18 years pouring money into you, and for what? So you could tell us you're not going to law school, so you could find yourself in a kitchen. I have a talent for pastry, Dad, I whispered, my voice trembling. I have a scholarship to the Culinary Institute. It's a real career. My mother, Beatrice, didn't even look at me. She was too busy polishing a silver trophy my brother, Kevin, had won for a debate tournament. Lawyers make partners, Maya. Cooks make sandwiches. We don't have sandwich makers in this family. If you walk away from the path we set, you walk away from us. Permanently. You don't mean that, I said, my heart breaking. Don't I? Richard reached into his pocket, pulled out his house key, and dropped it into the gutter. You're not our daughter anymore. Don't call. Don't write. And don't think you're getting a cent of the inheritance. It's all going to Kevin. Now get off my lawn. The door slammed. The deadbolt clicked. I stood there in the rain, 18 years old, with $40 in my pocket and a dream they thought was a joke. I didn't cry. Not then. I picked up my bags, walked to the bus station, and never looked back. 10 years later. I am no longer the girl with the garbage bags. I am the executive pastry chef and owner of Meal, a patisserie empire with locations in 3 major cities. I've been on the cover of Forbes, not for law, but for building a multi-million-dollar brand out of sugar, flour, and pure spite. I was sitting in my glass-walled office when my assistant, Sophie, walked in with a real estate notification. Chef, you asked me to keep an eye on the luxury market in your hometown, she said. The bank just moved a property into the immediate liquidation category. It's a massive colonial on Maple Lane. The owners defaulted on a predatory balloon mortgage. They have 30 days to vacate. I felt a chill go down my spine. I looked at the photos. The manicured lawn was overgrown. The white paint was peeling. The silver trophy house was falling apart. My parents had spent a decade trying to keep up appearances, financing a lifestyle they couldn't afford on a lawyer's salary that couldn't keep up with Richard's gambling and Kevin's failed business ventures. What's the price? I asked. $600,000 for a quick cash sale. The bank wants it gone. Buy it, I said, my voice as cold as a walk-in freezer. But use the holding company. I don't want my name on a single piece of paper until the day the keys are handed over. I pulled up to 42 Maple Lane in a nondescript black SUV. I didn't wear my chef's whites or my designer coat. I wore a plain gray suit and a pair of dark sunglasses. I wanted to see the rot before I revealed the cure. The front yard was a graveyard of status. A rusted BMW sat on blocks in the driveway. A for sale sign had been hacked down and tossed into the bushes. As I walked up the cracked stone path, the front door creaked open. My mother, Beatrice, stood there. She looked 20 years older than her age. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was thin and gray. She was clutching a cardboard box filled with old curtains. The bank sent someone early, she snapped, her voice still holding that sharp, condescending edge. We told the manager we needed until Friday. We have a lot of high-value items to catalog. I'm just here for the final walkthrough and asset verification, I said, keeping my voice low and clinical. She didn't recognize me. Why would she? The girl she kicked out was a scrawny teenager with tear-stained cheeks. The woman standing before her was a CEO with a steel spine. Fine, come in, she sighed, waving me inside. Richard, the girl from the bank is here. Watch your language. The interior of the house smelled like dust and desperation. The silver trophy my brother had won was still on the mantel, but it was tarnished black. The expensive Persian rugs were gone, replaced by bare, scratched hardwood. My father, Richard, shuffled out of the kitchen. He was wearing a tattered bathrobe and holding a glass of cheap scotch at 11:00 a.m. Another assistant, he grumbled, leaning against the doorframe. Listen, you tell your bosses that I'm a respected member of the legal community. This foreclosure is a temporary clerical error. My son, Kevin, is closing a major tech deal in Silicon Valley. He'll be wiring the funds any day now. I knew the truth. Kevin wasn't in Silicon Valley. He was in a studio apartment 3 towns over, dodging debt collectors for a failed crypto consultancy he'd started with my parents' retirement fund. The bank isn't interested in tech deals, Mr. Vance, I said, walking toward the kitchen. They're interested in the fact that you haven't paid the property taxes in 3 years. I'm here to ensure no high-value items, like the original crown molding or the copper piping, are removed before the new owner takes possession. The new owner, Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her throat. Someone already bought it. Who? It's only been on the immediate list for 48 hours. A private investor, I said, running my finger along the kitchen counter where I used to roll out dough in secret. Someone who knows the history of this house very well. Well, they're getting a steal, Richard spat. This house is a landmark. It's a tragedy that people like us are being pushed out by some faceless corporation. Actually, I said, turning to look him dead in the eye, the investor is a person, and she's arriving in 10 minutes to sign the final handover. You might want to finish packing that box, Beatrice. The locks are being changed at noon. Minutes later, a rusted sedan screeched into the driveway. My brother, Kevin, tumbled out. He was dressed in a suit that was 2 sizes too big, carrying a briefcase like he was heading into a boardroom instead of a shipwreck. Mom, Dad, I'm here, he shouted, bursting through the front door. I've got it. The bridge loan cleared. We can stop the sale. Richard's face lit up with a pathetic, desperate hope. Kevin, I knew it. I told this girl from the bank you were a genius. Kevin stopped short when he saw me standing by the fireplace. He puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating. Who is this? Some junior clerk? Listen, sweetie, you can tell your bosses to pack up. I've got a cashier's check right here. I looked at the check he pulled out. It was a poorly printed letter of intent from a company that didn't exist. It wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. That's not a check, Kevin, I said, my voice echoing in the empty room. That's a felony waiting to happen. How dare you, Beatrice shrieked. Kevin is a visionary. He's the only one who stayed to take care of us while that other one disappeared to be a servant. The other one didn't disappear, I said. I slowly reached up and took off my sunglasses. The silence that followed was deafening. Beatrice's eyes went wide. She looked at my face, then at the photo on the mantel, the one of the teenage girl they'd disowned, then back at me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Maya, Richard whispered, his glass of scotch trembling. No, you're supposed to be in a kitchen somewhere. You're supposed to be a failure. I am in a kitchen, Dad, I said, stepping forward. My own, in 3 different cities, and my failures have allowed me to do something you couldn't. I just bought this house. Cash. Kevin laughed, a high-pitched, nervous sound. You, buying this place. With what cupcake money? This is a 6-figure liquidation, Maya. Go back to your flour and eggs. The cupcake money paid for the black SUV in the driveway, Kevin, I said, pulling a thick folder from my bag. And it paid for the private investigator who tracked your tech deal to a basement in Scranton. You didn't lose their retirement fund on a business. You lost it on gambling, just like Dad. Richard went pale. Beatrice looked at her son, then at her husband. The web of lies they'd lived in for 10 years was unraveling in real time. You bought the house, Beatrice asked, her voice cracking. So we can stay. You're here to save us. I looked around the room where they'd told me I wasn't their daughter. Save you? I asked. No, I'm here for the inspection. And I've decided the first thing I'm doing as the new owner is a total gut renovation, starting with the front door. Richard's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. He slammed his scotch glass onto the mantel, the liquid splashing onto the tarnished debate trophy. You think you're clever, don't you? He roared. You think you can just swoop in and play landlord? I'm a lawyer, Maya. I know the law. This is a family home. There are protections against this kind of predatory behavior from relatives. I'll have the sale stayed. I'll claim undue influence. You can't just kick your parents onto the street. Dad, stop, Kevin hissed, looking at the folder in my hand with growing dread. No, Kevin, she's trying to humiliate us. Richard turned back to me, his finger shaking as he pointed at the door. "Get out of my house, Maya. We'll see you in court." "It's not your house, Richard," I said, my voice steady and cold. "And as for your legal expertise, you haven't stepped foot in a courtroom in 2 years since your license was suspended for commingling client funds. Or did you forget to tell Mom about that?" Beatrice let out a small, strangled cry, looking at her husband. He didn't deny it. He just looked away, his jaw working. "And about that court date you want," I continued, opening the folder. "I've already started the process, but not for the house. You see, when a bank liquidates a property this fast, they usually bundle the toxic assets, the secondary loans, the unpaid credit lines, the personal notes, and sell them off to collection agencies for pennies on the dollar." I pulled out a blue-backed legal document and slid it onto the kitchen table. "I didn't just buy the house. My holding company bought your debts, all $400,000 of them. The money you borrowed from those private lenders to keep Kevin's fake company afloat, I own those notes now. The credit cards you used to buy the groceries you're currently eating, I own those too." I leaned in, my shadow falling over the table. "Technically, I don't just own the roof over your head. I own the chair you're sitting in, the scotch in your glass, and the very air you're breathing in this room. And as your primary creditor, I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to collect." "Maya, please," Beatrice sobbed, grabbing my arm. Her hands felt thin and desperate. "We're your family. We made mistakes, yes, but you can't do this. Where will we go?" "You told me 10 years ago that I wasn't your daughter anymore," I said, gently but firmly removing her hand. "You told me the path I chose made me a stranger. Well, this is the path. I'm a businesswoman now, and a businesswoman doesn't let bad debt stay on the books." I looked at my watch. "The moving van I hired for you will be here in 1 hour. It's headed for a small 2-bedroom rental in the industrial district. I've paid the first month's rent. After that, you're on your own, just like I was." "The industrial district," Kevin scoffed. "That's a slum. I have a reputation." "You have a suitcase, Kevin," I said. "And if you're not out of here by noon, I'm calling the sheriff to execute the eviction. Along with a formal report on that cashier's check you just tried to pass off to a bank representative." Richard didn't move toward the boxes. Instead, he looked at Beatrice, a desperate glint in his eye. "The rental, the industrial district. You're delusional, Maya. We aren't going anywhere. This house has secrets you don't even know. Secrets that make your cupcake money look like pocket change." He scrambled toward the back of the library, shoving aside a heavy, moth-eaten armchair. He knelt on the floor, frantically prying at a loose floorboard near the hearth. "Richard, what are you doing?" Beatrice wailed. "The emergency fund," Richard grunted, his fingernails bleeding as he clawed at the wood. "My father, your grandfather, Maya, knew the world was full of thieves. He told me that if the banks ever failed, the real Vance legacy was under the hearth. He told me it was enough to buy a kingdom." I stood there watching him. I didn't stop him. I didn't even move. With a final, agonizing crack, the board splintered. Richard reached into the dark void beneath the floor and pulled out a heavy, rusted tin box. He let out a triumphant, jagged laugh. "See, you think you won. This is gold, Maya, physical gold bars. I'll buy back this house and burn your collection notes in the fireplace." He fumbled with the latch, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He forced it open, and the lid hit the floor with a dull thud. Inside, there was no gold. There were no diamonds, no cash, and no bearer bonds. There was only a stack of yellowing recipe cards, tied together with a faded blue ribbon, and a single, sealed envelope addressed to Maya. Richard stared at the recipes as if they were poisonous snakes. No, he told me. He said it was the wealth of a lifetime. I walked over and picked up the envelope. My grandfather had been the only one who didn't mock me when I spent my childhood weekends in the kitchen. He was a quiet man who hated the lawyer's life Richard had forced upon the family. He died when I was 12, and I thought he'd left me nothing but a memory of the smell of cinnamon. I opened the letter. "To my little bird, Maya, if you are reading this, it means your father has finally lost the roof over his head, and you are the one standing in the ruins. I knew he would chase the gold and ignore the grain." These recipes are the original formulas for the Vance Bakery, the business your father was too ashamed to inherit, the one he shut down to pretend we were aristocracy. They are worth more than any bar of gold, Maya. They are the heart of a home. Use them well. Let your father keep the box. The box is all he ever valued. The Vance Bakery had been a legend in the 1920s. People used to travel across state lines for their sourdough and honey cakes. My father had spent his life erasing that common history, pretending we came from old money instead of old flour. Recipes, Richard whispered, dropping a handful of the cards. He left. A bunch of instructions for bread. He bankrupted us for bread. He didn't bankrupt you, Richard, I said, tucking the ribbon of cards into my jacket. He gave you exactly what you wanted, the appearance of wealth, and he gave me exactly what I needed, a legacy that can't be foreclosed on. I looked at the clock. The moving van is at the gate. Kevin, help your father up. He's about to realize that a tin box makes a very poor pillow. Moving van was idling in the driveway, its exhaust puffing out like a sigh of defeat. Kevin, however, wasn't moving toward the boxes. He was tapping furiously on his phone, a sinister smirk growing on his face. You think you've won, Maya? Kevin sneered, holding up his screen. You might own the house, but I own the narrative. I just sent a tip to the Herald Sun. Local hero chef evicts elderly parents and hero brother into the slums. I included a photo of Mom crying on the porch. By tomorrow morning, your meal brand will be toxic. People don't like buying pastries from a monster. Beatrice looked up, a spark of hope in her tear-filled eyes. That's right. The public will hate you. You'll have to give us the house back just to save your reputation. I didn't flinch. I didn't even check my phone. Instead, I pulled out a chair, my chair, and sat down at the dusty dining table. The Herald Sun? I asked, tilting my head. That's a bold choice, Kevin. They're known for their eat the rich exposés, but there's something you should know about the print media industry. It's dying, almost as fast as your tech career. What's that supposed to mean? Kevin snapped. It means that 6 months ago, the Herald Sun was facing bankruptcy. They were looking for a white knight investor, someone who cared about local heritage. My holding company, the same one that owns your debt and this house, bought the controlling interest in the paper's parent company. Kevin's thumb froze over the send button for his follow-up email. I'm the chairman of the board, Kevin, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I literally just received a notification on my watch from the editor-in-chief asking if I wanted to greenlight a ridiculous tip about a family dispute on Maple Lane. I told him to hold it, not because I want to hide the truth, but because I have a much better headline in mind. I turned my watch screen around so they could see the draft headline my PR team had already prepared. Local chef, UNCOVERS, decade-long fraud. DISOWNED daughter, SAVES family, from debt-ridden scammer brother. I have the receipts for the crypto consultancy. You used to drain Mom and Dad's accounts, Kevin. I have the records of the commingled funds Dad lost. If you want to go to the press, we can go. But I promise you, I have more ink than you have lies. The phone slipped from Kevin's hand, clattering onto the hardwood. The hero brother looked like he was about to be sick. Now, I said, standing up and pointing toward the door. The movers are billed by the hour, and I'm a very busy woman. Beatrice, take your trophies. Richard, take your empty box. Kevin, take your phone. You're going to need it to look for a job. Richard didn't move toward the door. He looked at the empty tin box, then at the house he had turned into a temple of his own ego. A strange, glassy look took over his eyes. If I can't have it, he muttered, his voice cracking. No one can. This house is a Vance monument. It shouldn't be a community center or a bakery for the masses. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the bottle of high-proof scotch from the mantel and bolted toward the basement door. Richard, no, Beatrice screamed, but her husband was fueled by a decade of repressed failure. We heard his heavy footsteps thundering down the wooden stairs. A moment later, the smell of smoke began to waft up through the vents. He had splashed the alcohol onto the old stacks of legal files he'd stored in the cellar and struck a match. Kevin backed away toward the front door, his first instinct, as always, being to save his own skin. He's lost it. Maya, we have to get out. The whole place is going to go. I didn't run. I didn't even drop my folder. I walked over to the wall near the kitchen and flipped open a small, discreet panel that hadn't been there when I was a child. I told you, Dad, I called out, my voice raised just enough to carry down the stairs. I'm a professional. In my industry, if you don't have fire suppression, you don't get a license. I pressed a blue button on the panel. Instantly, a series of muffled thuds echoed through the floorboards. In the basement, the state-of-the-art chemical suppression system, installed 48 hours ago by my contractors, released a deluge of fire-killing foam. The smoke stopped instantly. There was no roar of flames, only the sound of Richard coughing and the hiss of the pressurized nozzles. I walked to the basement door and looked down. My father was sitting on the bottom step, covered from head to toe in white, sticky foam. He looked less like a fallen titan and more like a melted marshmallow. The monument was perfectly intact. The system is designed to preserve the structure, Richard, I said, looking down at him. It's very expensive, and since you just triggered it maliciously, I'll be adding the $15,000 recharge fee to your outstanding debt. He looked up at me, the fight finally, completely drained out of him. He looked at the foam-covered ruins of his legal files, the only things he had left of his old life, and began to sob. You thought I was the one who would burn things down because I was emotional, I said. But you're the one who tried to destroy the only home you ever had because your pride couldn't handle the truth. I turned to the sheriff's deputy, who had just pulled into the driveway, alerted by the silent alarm. He's all yours, officer. Attempted arson, reckless endangerment, and I believe we have some paperwork regarding those commingled client funds to discuss at the station. As the deputies hauled a shivering, foam-covered Richard toward the cruiser, Beatrice stood on the porch, her face a mask of calculated desperation. She saw her husband being taken away, her son already halfway to the car, and her lifestyle evaporating like steam. She turned to me, her eyes narrowing. The victim act was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp woman who had ruled this house with an iron tongue. You think you've won it all, don't you, Maya? She said, her voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. The house, the debt, the legacy. You think you're the rightful heir to the Vance name. I don't care about the name, Beatrice, I said, stepping past her to check the door frame. I care about the foundation. Well, maybe you shouldn't be so proud of that foundation, she spat. Why do you think Richard hated your talent so much? Why do you think he was so quick to throw you to the curb the moment you stepped out of line? It wasn't just because of the law school. I stopped. What are you talking about? Grandpa Arthur didn't just leave you those recipes because you were special, she sneered. He left them to you because he knew the truth. You're not a Vance, Maya, not by blood. The world seemed to tilt for a second. I looked at her, searching for the lie, but Beatrice had the look of a woman holding a royal flush. Richard was sterile after a bout of illness in his 20s, she whispered, leaning in so the deputies wouldn't hear. He was too proud to let the Vance line end, so we made a private arrangement. You were the result of a donor, a common baker's son from the next town over. That's where your talent comes from. That's why Richard couldn't stand to look at you. You were a living reminder of his failure. She folded her arms, a cruel smile playing on her lips. So, if I go to the press, or if I challenge the trust's blood relative clauses, your whole claim to the Vance estate, and those precious recipes, could be tied up in litigation for decades. You'll be bankrupt before you ever bake a single loaf of bread. She leaned back, looking smug. So, here is my counteroffer. You give us the deed, you wipe the debt, and I keep my mouth shut about your common origins. What do you say, daughter? I stood there in the silence of the porch, the weight of her words sinking in. For a moment, I felt like that 18-year-old girl again, standing in the rain with my garbage bags. Then I started to laugh. What's so funny? Beatrice snapped. You really don't get it, do you? I said, pulling Grandpa's letter back out of my pocket. You think this is a threat. You just gave me the best news of my life. News? You're a nobody. You're a charity case. No, I said, pointing to the very first line of the letter Beatrice had never read. To my little bird, Maya, blood doesn't make a baker, and it doesn't make a Vance. I chose you to carry this on because you were the only one who didn't have Richard's poison in your veins. I looked her dead in the eye. Grandpa knew. He always knew. And he specifically worded the trust to favor the chosen successor, not the biological heir. He didn't leave the house to a bloodline. He left it to a spirit. And as for my common father, I'd rather be the daughter of a baker who worked for his living than the daughter of a man who burned down his own house in a fit of pique. Beatrice's face fell. The last bargaining chip hadn't just failed, it had set me free. And Beatrice, I added, signaling the movers to take the last of her boxes. Since I'm not a Vance by blood, I guess I don't have to worry about family obligation anymore. Sheriff, you can add extortion to the list of charges for the lady of the house. Beatrice was led away in tears, her final attempt at psychological warfare backfiring so spectacularly that she didn't even fight the deputy when he ushered her toward the car. Kevin had already fled, likely to pawn whatever, high-value, items he'd managed to stuff into his pockets before the lockdown. I stood in the quiet of the library, holding Grandpa's recipe cards. Now I understood why the handwriting on some of them was different, lighter, more fluid. They weren't just the Vance family secrets. They were a conversation between my grandfather and the man he had actually respected. I turned to Sophie, my assistant, who had been watching from the hallway. Sophie, I need you to find someone, I said. His name is Julian Thorne. He would have lived in Oak Haven 30 years ago. Beatrice called him a common baker. Find out if he's still around. It didn't take long. In the age of digital footprints, a man like Julian Thorne was easy to spot. He hadn't built an empire, he had built a life. 2 days later, I drove to a sleepy town 2 hours away. Tucked between a hardware store and a florist was a shop with a faded wooden sign, Thorne's Hearth. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of fermented yeast and toasted oats, the exact smell of my childhood dreams. Behind the counter was a man with flour-dusted forearms and eyes that looked exactly like mine in the mirror. He was pulling a tray of sourdough from a stone oven. "Help you with something?" he asked, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "I'm looking for the man who taught Arthur Vance how to make his honey cakes," I said. Julian froze. He looked at me, really looked at me, and his breath hitched. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't ask why I was there. He just looked at my hands, which were subconsciously tracing the edge of the counter, and then back at my face. "Arthur told me he'd find a way to send you here," Julian whispered. "He told me he'd make sure the little bird found her way home." "You knew about me." I knew Richard Vance would never let a commoner near his daughter. Arthur and we made a deal. He would provide for you, give you the best education, and keep you safe from the truth until you were strong enough to handle it. He used to send me photos. Every time you won a prize, every time you opened a new shop. I was there, Maya, in the background, just watching you fly. He walked around the counter, his eyes glistening. "I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I'm sorry I let them take you." "Don't be," I said, looking at the modest, struggling bakery. "They didn't take me. They just held me for a while, but I'm a Vance by name and a Thorne by nature, and I think it's time we combine the two." I looked around the shop. It was beautiful, but it was failing. The roof leaked, and the equipment was 40 years old. "I just bought a house on Maple Lane," I said. "It has a professional-grade kitchen, a lot of history, and a legacy that needs a master baker. What do you say, Julian? Want to help me turn 42 Maple Lane into the real Vance and Thorne bakery?" The grand opening of Vance and Thorne was the event of the decade. We didn't just renovate the house. We transformed the entire ground floor into a warm, sun-drenched flagship bakery and cafe. The upper floors became the headquarters for the Vance Foundation, dedicated to funding culinary scholarships for kids who, like me, were told their dreams weren't prestigious enough. The line of people stretched 3 blocks down Maple Lane. The mayor was there. The local press, now under my fair but firm leadership, was there, and the air was filled with the scent of Grandpa's honey cakes and Julian's famous sourdough. Julian stood beside me, wearing a crisp new apron. He didn't look like a commoner anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found his place in the world. "Ready, Maya?" he asked, his hand on the ribbon. "Ready," I said. As we cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted. For the first time in its history, 42 Maple Lane wasn't a fortress of exclusion. It was a place where everyone was welcome. 5 miles away, in a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment above a noisy auto body shop, the atmosphere was very different. Richard sat on a sagging sofa, his eyes fixed on the small, flickering television. He was out on bail, awaiting trial, and his legal community, friends, had long since blocked his number. Beatrice sat at a plastic kitchen table, staring at a stack of unpaid utility bills. "The news says she's making millions on the first day," Richard muttered, his voice bitter. "The house! She's turned our library into a tasting room. It's a disgrace." A heavy knock sounded at the door. Beatrice jumped, her heart racing. "Is that the sheriff again?" She opened the door to find a delivery driver holding a small, elegant white box tied with a gold ribbon. "Delivery for Richard and Beatrice Vance, from the owner of Meal." Beatrice took the box with trembling hands. Inside was a single, perfectly crafted honey cake, the recipe Richard had tried to bury. Tucked into the side was a final note on heavy, cream-colored stationery. "I promised I would take care of the high-value items in the house. This cake is the only one that truly matters. I've decided to forgive the $15,000 fire suppression fee as a gesture of family goodwill. However, the rest of the debt stands. I've arranged for a job for Kevin at the Foundation's warehouse. He starts Monday at 5:00 a.m. It's hard work, Dad. It's common. But maybe, for the first time in his life, he'll actually earn the bread he eats. Enjoy the cake. It's the last taste of the Vance legacy you'll ever have." Maya Thorne. Richard stared at the cake. He reached out to take a piece, but his hand stopped. He realized that the daughter he had thrown away hadn't just survived. She had thrived by embracing everything he was too proud to love. Outside, the sun set over the new Vance and Thorne sign. I stood on the porch, watching the last of the customers leave, feeling the solid, honest weight of the recipes in my pocket. The garbage bags were long gone. I was finally home. The end. The lesson: never judge a person's worth by their pedigree. Real value isn't found in a trophy or a title. It's baked into the soul.